Hi everyone and welcome to the video. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the new Mark III power armor that has just been released by Games Workshop, and we're going to be painting this up in the Traitor Legion, the Death Guard. This is one of my favourite legions to paint up, and I think the reason for that is because weathering shows up really good on this sort of colour. The first little bit, as I was undercoating and stuff, for some reason that 3 minutes of footage decided it didn't want to work. It got corrupt. The forces of chaos corrupted it. But it's really simple, and I do post the colours on the screen. You'll see a little bit of airbrushing in there as well. But essentially, I primed it in Vallejo Israeli sand. If you don't have that, you can use Wraithbone as an alternative. For the shadows, I used a little bit of Steel Legion Drab, and then for the highlights I used Army Painter Bleach Bone. However, if you're going to do it in the opposite way, say if you don't want to go out and get the Israeli sand, is get Wraithbone primer, prime it in Wraithbone, and just fire some of that Steel Legion Drab into the shadow areas, and you will be good to go. And once all that's dried, it's just a case of going through and blacking out all your areas. So the first colour that we're going to use, obviously I've not gone super careful with the blacks. It's just literally to darken it up, ready for the metallic areas and stuff like that. So as you can see, I was using Death Corpse Drab. Now I've thinned this 50-50 to water, and I'm just applying 2 thin coats to all the areas that we want to be green. This includes like your shoulder blades and everything like that. Now there's a reason why I thin it a little bit more than usual, and basically when we're going up each layer up towards our highlights, we're just going to be using, and I've mentioned it in other videos, this like rough sketchy style with our brush. So we're just literally slapping it on and we're just making marks here and there. But what that does at first, obviously at first few layers, it can look a little bit rough, but as we start moving up those layers and applying those colours, even here I'm still on the Death Corpse Drab, and you can see how it's sort of acting as a highlight, and you can sort of see, because we've got that little bit of separation in the pigment, it's starting to build up texture on our miniature. And as we move up now to our next colour, again we're just introducing a little bit of lighter colour, Death World Forest, and again we're just using this sketchy style. And now what that does is, as we move up the layers, it's going to add to that like battle worn look, and it's going to create texture, and you can almost sort of start to build like little chips up in your armour, and highlight underneath them, etc., and add scratches. But overall, as you keep going up in layers and layers and layers, again it just adds to that texture, which is what we're trying to achieve. When you first put it on as well, one little tip, you might think, oh god, I've put it on a bit too light. Now that's not always, you see how light it goes on here on the shoulder blade, it's not going to dry that light. It always goes on a little bit lighter than what it's actually going to dry like, so don't be too afraid. And to get your highlight points, all you want to do is just imagine that the light is coming down from the top of the shoulder blade, so as we get down towards the bottom, I'm not going to be applying as much. And you can switch it up, like you can see here we're using a little bit of a stippling motion, and now I've gone back to the rough, and I'm still using that same second colour. So even though we've only done like 4 to 5 layers, I've only used 2 colours, and you can sort of see the transitions now and the effects that it's starting to have. And again, as we start going up these layers, you'll see like little sections where it's like still dark. And what I do as I start going up, I start to like sort of edge highlight underneath these as though they are like little chips and dinking armour that's not quite gone down to like the metal surface. And again, it's just creating more layers of like grimdarkness and texture, and all that sort of good stuff. But just it's a case of persevering with it, letting it dry up, and getting those highlight points. And then finally, this is our final highlight colour. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that, but I think it's Ogrin Camo. These are just really nice desaturated greens, which I think work perfect. And here's a good example now of, you just saw at the bottom of that shoulder blade how I've highlighted underneath like one of the shadow areas of what we've created texture, and automatically now it makes it look 3D, like like it's a chip that's dinked down in the armour, and these shoulder blades have had a little bit of a bad time, and the weathering's got to them. We will be coming back to these a little bit later on, after we've done our wash phases and all that sort of stuff, just to put some final highlights on them and go along that way. Now for metallics, obviously we're using Vallejo metal colour. If you've never used these, I highly recommend them. They've got so much good coverage. They are very, very thin paints, which means we can put them through an airbrush without much thinner. But if you've not got any of these, I'd seriously go out and invest in some. They're so good, and we've been able to use them as a brush. We use them with a brush as well. It just works brilliantly. Now we've got some scale colour 75, which is one of my favourite metals, which is decayed metal, and we're just working our way around the trim for all these sections and just applying it to all, like, even though it's not like gold, it's like a bronzy colour with a death guard, and just work your way around. And then one thing I will say about scale 75 paints is they do dry pretty matte. Now if you're into that, obviously it's a bonus. I do like them to be quite matte, which a little bit later on we are going to be adding a matte varnish once we've got to a couple more phases. And what's good about using a matte varnish on this, or any sort of like satin varnishes, is if you've decided not to use an airbrush and use like the method that I've used with like the stippling, it sort of smooths it out a little bit. Now we've got Rattling Grime, which is one of my favourite contrast paints. And I work my way around my miniature and all the metallic areas. On this one I don't think I actually did the metals, but you can actually do it on the metals, like the silver metals, if you want to do that as well, and it just adds a little bit more griminess. Now I know Rattling Grime is a contrast paint, but we can use it as a little bit of a wash. It's going to dull it down, and it's going to add that little bit of grime to our miniature. Now, what I've done, I've given it a wash of Dark Wash. I did put the alternative, because I'm not sure if this is available anymore. A lot of people saying it's hard to get hold of, it's not in shops. But AK Dark Brown Wash is literally the exact same. I highly recommend either of these. Only reason I'm using this is because it's the one I use, and I just want to work my way through it and sort of get rid of it, and then I can move on to some other sort of washes. But with it being an enamel, I'm just applying it all over the miniature. Give it a few moments to dry. Obviously it's sort of semi-dry here, but you can go straight into it. And I've just got these little sponges. These sponges are a lot better than using cotton buds. A lot of people use cotton buds in the Grimdark style, but you get lots of fuzzies. With these you don't, and the beauty of these is you can actually use one for like your entire miniature. I've used them on tanks and stuff, and you can literally like sort of wash them out in your little bowl of mineral spirits, and any hard to reach places just jump in with a brush. Now the metallics is just Rungfang Steel by Citadel, or any sort of brighter silver that you've got. I've got like a really small flat brush here. I love flat brushes for dry brushing, especially to get into those crevices, and I always dry brush my metallics. Now for me, you can edge highlight them, but I think dry brushing just gets an overall more realistic look. For our brown areas, we've been using Runlord Brass. Now, sorry, I really should say as well, before all this, after we'd used our enamel washers, I gave the entire miniature a matte varnish, and then we go into our highlights, which is good because you sort of get like a matte undertone with like the more satin finishes. Now I want to spend a bit more time talking about chipping, because a lot of people do struggle with chipping, and if it's not done correctly it can look a little bit too, the chips can be too big. So I always start off with a little bit of sponge chipping, and again it's just Rhinox hide with a little bit of sponge chipping and making sure I'm getting all those edges and little areas. And why I use a sponge first is because sometimes you can get marks with this which don't necessarily go on as big as what they would with a brush. There are people out there that can do them with a brush, really small and really simple, but I like to get like a base of my chips down, and then I jump to the brush and start working my way around with a brush. So this might be joining up some of the little scratches and stuff, but the trick to this for me, if you want to get really nice thin chips, is obviously you need a good brush with a good point on it. Mix a little bit of water in so it flows nicely off the brush. Now once you've dipped your brush in your paint, it's a good idea to either wipe it off on a bit of a towel or a cloth, and just use the slightest bit of pressure when you're applying it, and then you'll find that you get like thinner ones, and if you apply a bit more pressure, or you can like dot them like this and you can start to get bigger ones and join them up. But it's a case of, you know, mixing a bit of sponge chipping in with a little bit of brushwork, and to me this is a really good way of doing it. Now places like here, like the backpack, because it's such a small area, I almost edge highlight it as you would, you know, with the side of the brush. But what we're actually doing is, even though we're not edge highlighting it, we're actually edge highlighting with the chips, and it's a really good way to get some nice thin chips on the edges of your miniature. So if you do get to an edge, do what you'd normally do if you were going to edge highlight it, but obviously we're doing it in reverse and creating some chips. I always keep a lot of my chips towards the bottom of the miniature, especially around like the legs and knees and stuff, like elbow pads. These are places where, if it were realistic, if these are in battle, these places are more likely going to have some more chips. Now we're going to go back to Wraithbone. Let's say if you started off with that rather than doing the method that I used. Obviously it is going to dull down a little bit after you've done all your washes, but we can use Wraithbone again to start edge highlighting and just highlighting underneath those chips. It's always a good idea to highlight underneath your chips because it just adds that little bit more of a 3D effect. I don't do them all, any sort of like big chips or scratches, then I sort to do them. You don't have to go around every single one and edge highlight every single chip, because it might look a little bit weird. But when I'm doing the edge highlights on bits that might not have chipping, again I'm using like a stippling motion and a scratchy motion. And as you can see here now, this is where like the light source is going to mainly hit our character or our whatever we're painting. And the same technique as what I used on the shoulder pads is I'm just doing that just to highlight some more areas on the head and the chest area, and coming down onto the arm. And again, it's going to add that little texture, same as what we've done on the shoulder pads, and it's going to also highlight that area and draw your eyes to that section as we start to move along. But there's no like adding more white to it. If you want to add a bit more white to make it brighter, feel free to do that, but I just used Wraithbone in this case to complete those highlights. Moving on now, obviously we've gone back and we've added a little bit more of the Ogren camo, and like I said, we were going to be coming back to these just to emphasize those chips and scratches and stuff that we've just added on, and then also I can add one last little final highlight onto those shoulder blades just to wrap it all up. Also, for the guys that, are not into airbrushing or don't have airbrushing, they maybe, use rattle cans, there are some videos on my channel where I show you how you can get, and it builds them up pretty quick. You can paint them pretty quick just using, like a stippling motion with a dry brush and going up layers. And it's also, in some cases, it looks even better than when you do actually airbrush. Now, one final little bit of weathering. I don't think you were going to get through one of my videos without using this, which is Dirty Downs Rust. Now, one little thing I've done different to what I normally do and grab it out of the pot, I've actually put a little bit onto my wet palette. Now, obviously, this stuff does dry extremely quick, but one thing I noticed is by putting it on my wet palette and adding a little bit more water to it, it sort of dried a little bit lighter, like the rust activated a little bit lighter when it started to dry, and that's really good, because sometimes with Dirty Downs Rust it can be very sporadic and you're not 100% like what you are going to get, but if you can get it on nice and light first like I have, and then if you want to go back in and darken it, you just add more Dirty Downs Rust to it. So like the rule of thumb with Dirty Downs Rust, the thinner and watery it is, the lighter it is, and the thicker it is, the more darker you sort of get, which is nice, because all I'm doing is just going in and adding streaks. And to finish up, a little bit of Nylock Oxide. I were going to use the Dirty Downs version of this. It is a fantastic product, but my pot seems to have died a little bit, and it required a lot of shaking and stirring up, which I just thought, I'll grab some Nylock Oxide out. It'll just be a lot quicker and easier and more accessible for other people. And I'm just messing about with variations with more water, less water, and just to get different effects around it, or just to add a little bit of verdigris. But yeah, verdigris is by Dirty Downs also fantastic. And there we have it. That is our miniature. The eyes, my eyes for these, because they're quite hard to get into, I just painted them white and used a little bit of red just to get through them. A little bit of, Blood Angels red on that white, the contrast paint. The base was really simple. It was just using AK Dark Earth, and I just waited for it to dry and then bang some pigment powders on it. There were no like dry brushing the sand or anything like that, but if you're going to use pigment powders, always brush up a little bit onto the legs just to achieve a better look. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to go check out some more Mark III Marine videos that I've done, I've released one with 5 Loyalist. So if you want to go and check that out, please go and check that out to get the colour schemes for them. And you can follow some of the techniques that you've used in this video. Cheers for watching, guys, and I'll catch you soon.